on Lamed Zayin and Beis. Eved Shenishba Upadu. He had a slave who was captured and was redeemed. So I guess in the beginning here, like I mentioned to you before, Hashalech deals a lot with slaves, and begin right over here. So you have we're talking here, generally speaking, about an Eved Kanani, a non-Jewish slave who has sort of a quasi-Jewish status. Whether he's a male or a female, he has the same obligations as a woman. And the slave was captured, Upadu, and then he was redeemed. Im Nishum Eved, if they redeemed him as a slave, Yishtabed, then they can keep him as a slave. Im Nishum Ben Chayron, they redeemed him as to be a free man. Lo Yishtabed, they should not make him work. In other words, he's free. In either case, they should make him work, and he's not free. Okay. Now, obviously, the question over here in the Mishnah is exactly who are we talking about? Are we talking about the original owner? Are we talking about the guy who redeemed him? And the Gemara will sort of clarify that. The Gemara says, another question. In other words, there's a concept. The concept of Yush is that when somebody sort of gives up from finding something, then there's some amount of ownership that's relinquished. This is true whether the item is lost or the item is stolen, or captured by somebody else. Now, with regard to a slave, if the master gives up on ever getting back a slave, presumably the slave now becomes free. Now, typically, if you give up from finding something and then somebody else finds it, what happens is that the other person, the finder, gets to keep it. The item is yours until the finder finds it, at which point he can acquire it. A slave is a little bit different because he can acquire himself. So as soon as you sort of give up from finding something, it could be that the slave is able to acquire himself. We'll see in a moment sort of what the status of that is. Okay, so if it's before, in other words, if the guy still has hope of getting back his slave, why can't he keep his slave? Talking about where he gave up and he doesn't think he'll find the slave again. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry. So even if you redeem him as a slave, why should he be required to work for you? If it would seem that he should be freed, because the master gave up on finding him. Therefore, the slave acquires himself. Abai says we're talking about before he gave up. He still has hopes of finding him. If he's redeemed as a slave, the first master can still have him as a slave. However, if he's redeemed to be a free man, then then nobody can make him work, not the first master, not the second master, i.e. the one who redeemed him. He's this quote unquote second master. The Rabbi Sheni Lloyd, the whole Shubin. Okay. The second master can't redeem him can't enslave him because he redeemed him to be a free man. He never had intention to acquire him as a slave. The Rabbi Rishon Nami Loi, to the first master, the first master can't either use him as a slave, because we're concerned that he might withhold himself and not redeem the slave. 1 second. Okay, the idea is as follows. According to the first opinion, Abaya's opinion, in the first opinion of the Mishnah, people would prefer to redeem a free man than to redeem a slave. Obviously, this sort of makes sense. The sort of definition of a slave is somebody who does not have his own identity. His own identity is subservient to his master, and therefore it's sort of you free him, you spend all this money to redeem him, and then there's no him. You're really benefiting his master. However, if he's a free man, then you're redeeming him. It feels much better. And therefore, according to Abaya, people would much rather redeem a free man than to redeem a slave. And so therefore, if they redeem him to be a free man, we do not allow the first master to keep him as an indentured servant. Okay, Rava says, I'm sorry, second of the wide lines. Benkach or Benkach ishtabit. In either scenario, you can make the slave work. Keep the slave as a slave. Because he holds the first opinion says people only want to redeem free men, not slaves. Shmuel says no, people would be equally happy to redeem both types of people. And therefore, there is no reason to require him to be a free man, even if he's redeemed to be a free man. If he's owned by somebody else, that person can keep him as a slave. Okay, that's the opinion of Abaya. So Abaya says this is all talking about before the master gave up an ownership. If the master, on the other hand, did give up from ever finding him, so then in either scenario, presumably he would be a free man. Rava says, La'olam la'achar yish. We're talking about a scenario after he gave up. The opposite of Abaya. L'shum eved yishtabed l'Rabbi Sheni. L'shum menchorin lo yishtabed lo l'Rabbi Rishon v'lo l'Rabbi Sheni. If he was redeemed as a slave, so then the second master acquires him as a slave, and he's able to use him as a servant. If he redeems him as a free man, he cannot serve. He does not serve as a slave, neither to the master who owned him, neither to the master that redeemed him. The second master, he cannot serve as a slave because the guy redeemed him to be a free man. He never acquired him. The Rabbi Rishon the first master can either have him as a slave because he gave up from ever finding him, and therefore the slave acquires himself. Rav Shmuel says, Rav Shmuel says either way you can require him to be a slave, like the opinion of Chizkiah. In other words, even though it's after Yush, we still require him to be a slave for the first master. The second guy redeemed him to be a free man, but because the first guy he belonged to the first guy, therefore we require him to work as a slave. Why is this? Because we're concerned that if everybody knows that there's a way out of slavery, all you need to do is get captured. So then we're concerned people would allow themselves to be captured. Chizkiah says, why did we say that in either scenario the slave has to go back to slavery? That people shouldn't go and get captured by highwaymen so that they should escape bondage from their master. Okay, so we have two opinions, Abaya and Rafal, whether or not the Mishnah is talking about before he gave up hope or even after he gave up hope.
Repeat that last sentence, Rabbi. Move fast,
the debate between Abaya and Rava is if the Mishnah's scenario is before the guy gave up hope from finding a slave, in which case he still really owns a slave, or after he gave up hope, in which case he sort of relinquished some rights. And in that scenario, if you redeem him to be a free man, he remains a free man. Now, according to Abaya, once you give up on the slave acquires himself. According to Rava, we'll see in a moment, what actually happens is the slave is acquired by the captors. The captors acquire the slave, and then the second master acquires the slave from the captors. Okay. Anyway, for the moment, the Gemara has a very good question on Rava. According to Rava, what's the reason of Rav Shimon? Rav Shimon disagrees. He says in either scenario, you keep him as a slave. Why is that? According to Abaya, the reason is very simple.
Make themselves a target.
What do you say?
So the slave would make himself a target for capture.
Right. No. According to Abaya, the reason is because there's no difference in terms of redeeming slaves versus redeeming captives. Whereas redeeming free people. There's no reason to require him to be a free man if he's redeemed with the intention of him being a free man. According to Rava, the concern is we're afraid he might be released. He might try to redeem himself by getting captured. Okay. Samara says, Meisvei. Rav Shimon asked the following question. Rav Shimon explained himself as following. Rav Shimon explains himself. What's his reason? There's no difference whether it's to redeem a free man or to redeem a slave from captivity. Obviously, this is a clear indication. According to Abaya's explanation, the reason that we're talking about where the master did not give up, and therefore there's no reason why it shouldn't belong to the original master. Doesn't, regardless of whatever reason, the redeemer decided to redeem him as either as a slave or as a free man. It makes no difference. The first master still owns him. That makes a lot of sense. Then it makes sense why Ramil is justifying that even if you redeem him as a free man, it makes no difference whether or not he actually is a free man, because regardless of whether he is or isn't, people will redeem him. According to Rav, the reason is not because it's equally important to redeem a slave from captivity and to redeem a free man. The reason is because of Chizkiah. We're concerned the slave might allow himself to be captured. Rav says, in other words, Rav Shimon was throwing the kitchen sink, as they say, on the rabbis. He wasn't sure what they were saying. Were you talking? The rabbis say that if he's freed as a slave, then he stays in slavery. If he's freed as a free man, he goes free. So Rav Shimon says, I don't know what you're talking about. If you're talking about before Yish, Kishem. In other words, there's no reason. If you're talking about before Yish, before the guy gave up, the first master still owns him. There's no justification for allowing him to be free, even if he's redeemed with that intention. Why is there no reason? Because people will redeem slaves from captivity just as much as they'll redeem free men. And moreover, and if you're talking about after Yush, after the guy is given up, so now it's in the hands really of the second master. I still don't understand why. If he redeems him with the intention of being a free man, he remains a free man, because we should be concerned of Chizkiah, that everyone will go and let themselves be captured. Okay, so if it's before years, before the guy gave up, that's what you're referring to, Hainek Hashem, that is the Hainek Hashem, that is the equivalence that Rav Shimon is arguing on. There's no difference in terms of redeeming a free man from captivity or redeeming a slave from captivity. In both scenarios, people redeem them. And therefore, if it's still owned, but the slave is still owned by the first master because he hasn't given up hope yet, it should belong to him. So if you're talking about after Yush, to the Chizkiah, so then I would argue to you, like Chizkiah, we cannot allow a slave to run away and then become a free man, because then all slaves will do that. Okay, so Mara says, according to Rava, it says that we're talking about after Yush. The guy's already given up hope. In other words, like I explained before, if you lose an object, right? You drop your wallet. You look for 2 days and you can't find it. At that point, you stop looking. You gave up on it. Somebody else finds it. He acquires it. It belongs to him. By a slave, it's a little bit different, because the slave can acquire himself. You give up on finding the slave. You don't know where he went. You stop looking for him. He can acquire himself. Now, in terms of captivity, the master redeems him from captivity. Who did he acquire him on behalf? Why didn't the slave acquire himself? So the Gemara says, Mishavai. He bought him from the captors. The captors actually acquired him. So the Gemara says, Shavai Gufei Mikanelai. Can a highwayman who captures somebody, does he acquire that person? He captures a slave. Can he acquire the slave? So Gemara says, he could. He could acquire him for his income. We'll explain here. The truth of the matter is, there's two ways to own a slave. One of them is to own them for their income producing ability. The other one is sort of a kinyan guf. You own the slave itself. And in terms of religious significance, there is religious significance to being owned, to having your entire essence owned by another person. You have the status of a slave. Whereas if you're owned just for income, then you sort of don't have that religious component. You're sort of owned for income. Okay. The Omer Shlogish explains as follows: how do we know that a slave can also acquire, a non-Jew can acquire slaves for income? One second. You could buy a slave from a non-Jew, but they cannot purchase a Jewish slave. And they can't acquire from each other a slave. Presumably, this means a non-Jew can't sell a slave to another non-Jew. The Gemara will have to clarify this in a moment, because the next line of the Gemara is, I would think that they cannot acquire a slave from each other, which is the opposite of what we just said. The Gemara says, I would think they can't acquire. You just said they can't. Like, what's sort of the question? The Gemara says, I'll explain to you as follows. They cannot acquire the slave itself from each other. I would think that they cannot acquire the income earning potential of the slave from each other. For that, I would say Amrit Kal V'Chomer. I would prove to you as follows: if a non-Jew is able to acquire a Jewish slave, so obviously, if a non-Jew acquires a Jew as a slave, he's acquiring the income producing capability and not the essence of a free man, which can never be acquired. So an Oved Kachavim should be able to acquire the income earning potential of an Oved Kachavim himself. Maybe that requires a monetary payment. What is chazaka? Chazaka is to use something. So in other words, now a highwayman or a pirate who captures a person, obviously is with strength is maintaining control over them and telling them exactly what to do. That's chazaka. Who said that they have such a type of kinyan? Rav Papa says, Amen u'Moav tiru b'sichen. Amen and Moav were purified with sichen. What does this mean? It means that Jewish people were enjoined not to fight against Ammon and Moav. However, what eventually happened was Sichon, a non-Jewish nation, captured the nations of Ammon and Moav and enslaved them. And then the Jews were able to capture Sichon because there was no prohibition of capturing Sichon. Now, how did Sichon capture Ammon and Moav? Obviously, the Chazaka. They literally fought a battle and they captured them. So therefore, we see very clearly that, and it's no longer called Ammon and Moav's territory. It's called Sichon's territory. Evidently, we see that Chazaka works. How do we know that a Oved Kachavim can acquire a Jewish person through Chazaka, through capturing? The Canaanim at some point captured a bunch of Jews, and it says that these Jews belonged to their captors. Obviously means that if during war they take Jews into captivity, the captors own those Jews. Amr of Sham Rabba, Amr Rabbi Yehudah. Sham Rabba says in the name of Rabbi Yehudah, Evet Shabarach and Beis Hasurim Yotz L'cheres. If a slave runs away from prison, what type of prison here? This means he ran away from the pirates or the highwaymen. They were, keeping him in prison. He goes free. Forced his master to actually write him out a document of emancipation. Okay, so Rabbi Yehudah says that if he runs away, he becomes free. Hold on a second. Rav Shimon Gamliel said in the Mishnah, in either case of redeeming a slave from captivity, he remains a slave, regardless of the intention of redemption. Hold on a second. The Rabbi Machana says in the name of Rabbi Yehudah, whenever Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said something in the Mishnah, the halacha follows him. Chutz me Arav, that's an Arav Yitzchak Shtaris, Tzidain Uraya Achroina. Separate discussions exactly what those are. I believe one of them will come up soon in Kedushin, somewhere in the beginning of the Babas. Okay. Anyway, without getting into specifics, the halacha follows of Shimon Gamliel. Hold on a second. Bishlem la'abaya. According to Abaya, this makes sense. Muki lo lahaylif nayish v'hayla achar yish. So, as follows: if, according to Shimon Gamliel, if he was redeemed before the guy gave up, then he remains a slave. However, when Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, Rabbi Yehudah says, the question is as follows: Rabbi Yehudah says the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, that you remain a slave. Rabbi Yehudah also says if you run out of the prison, you become free. The question seems to be a contradiction. Well, it's not a contradiction. According to Abaya, it's very easy. When do you remain a slave? If you were redeemed before the master gave up on you. When does Rabbi Yehudah say if you run away, you become free? That's after he gave up on you. That makes a lot of sense. According to Rabbi, it says, I'm talking about after he gave up. There seems to be a contradiction between Rabbi Yehudah. In other words, according to Rava, even if you've given up, it doesn't make a difference. If the guy, according to Rav Shimon Gamliel, we still require you to be a slave. Why? Because we're afraid that people will go ahead and redeem themselves and let themselves be captured to be redeemed. So Rava says, hold on. Time in mind, what's the reason? Mishum Dechizkiya. We're concerned the guy's going to run free. Shiny. If a guy runs out of a prison system, it takes an immense amount of bravery. Hashlik Tola Masar Nafshi. He knows that if he's caught, he's going to be killed. Apuli Apple Nafshi Gaisis. Do you think he's going to run to get captured by highwaymen? This guy is clearly a reckless risk taker. And therefore, it's not logical to presume that if we allow him to be free, people will go ahead and, allow themselves to be captured. Amsedemar Shmuel Ishtavoi, the maidservant of Shmuel, was captured. Parkur Lashum Amsa. They redeemed him with the intention that she should remain a slave, a maidservant. The Shadrule, and they sent him to Mar Shmuel. Shalchuli, they explained, and I Rav Shimon Gamliel Svirlan. We hold like Rav Shimon Gamliel. At you, Ina Mikrabon Svirle, even if you hold like the rabbis, and Lashum Amsa Parkinale. We redeemed her with the intention that she should remain your slaves. Parpina la Niela. That was our intention when we redeemed her. The Inu Savar, they thought Lefnei Yeshava. V'lohi la'achar Yeshava. They thought that Shmuel did not give up on maidservant, but it wasn't the case. Shmuel had already given up on finding her. Because Shmuel had given up on finding her, Shmuel not only freed her, but he said you don't even require a document of emancipation. Shmuel Tamei, Shmuel according to his own reasoning, Shmuel says somebody who frees a slave, someone who makes a slave ownerless. Shmuel says if somebody makes a slave ownerless, he makes him hefker. So then he goes out free, he acquires himself effectively, and he does not require a document of emancipation. Shneimar v'chol evet ish miknas kesef, evet the verse talks about an eved of a man. Hold on, eved ish v'lo eved isha, a slave can't own a servant. Ella, what does this mean? Eved sheyesh le'reshus l'Rabbi olav kari eved, and le'reshus l'Rabbi olav ain't kari eved. If a master frees you, that freedom requires an emancipation. But if you were made ownerless, so you don't there's no one who owns you, then you're not a slave anymore by definition, and you don't even require a document of emancipation. Similar story. The maidservant of Rabbi Abba Bar Zutra was captured. There was this non-Jewish man that redeemed her with the intention of marrying her. So they sent a message to Rabbi Abba. If you want to be good, send her a document of emancipation. So Gemara wants to know why exactly they asked him for this document. Why does he have to free her because she's in captivity? Hey Chidami, what's the scenario? If the guy is willing, the non-Jew is willing to have her redeemed, he didn't fall in love with her. Why do we require a document of emancipation? If he's not willing to redeem her, then what does it help if she's emancipated? So Gemara says, it's where they could redeem her. If she was a free man, then they would be able to get together enough money to free her. But without that, they would not have enough money to free her. An alternative explanation: in scenario where he can't, the people do not have, the non-Jew does not want to let the people redeem her. If they send a document of emancipation, then everyone's going to find out this non-Jew is marrying a Jewish woman, and he will redeem her. Okay, so in other words, the presumption here is misaz labape. In other words, it's sort of degrading for a non-Jewish knight to be with a Jewish woman, and therefore send an emancipation document. Everybody will know she's a Jewish woman. He'll be embarrassed, and he'll be willing to allow her to be redeemed. So the presumption here is that it's embarrassing for a non-Jew to be with a Jewish woman. The Gemara says the opposite is true. We learned the non-Jews are so infatuated, with Jews, they'd rather a Jewish animal than their own wives, than their own non-Jewish wives. So therefore, it would seem that certainly a Jewish woman would be even more prestigious for them. So the Gemara says, these are their private fetishes. But publicly, it looks embarrassing for a non-Jew to be married to a Jewish woman that was redeemed from captivity, and therefore, if you send a document of emancipation, everybody will know that she's a Jewish woman, and this man will allow her to be redeemed. There was this maidservant in Pampadisa. She was selling herself out, and she was known to be pretty loose with herself. Abaya says, okay, so we'll discuss this at length in a moment, but there's an open question whether or not it is permitted to free a slave. Rabbi Yehudah says it's a violation of a positive commandment. It's a positive commandment to make sure slaves remain indentured, and therefore we cannot free her because we'll violate the law of Rabbi Yehudah. But if it wasn't for Rabbi Yehudah, I would force the master to redeem her. This way, in other words, if she's a slave, she doesn't really have a hope of a long-term relationship, or she doesn't have a very positive perspective on that, and therefore that's presumably why she's allowing herself to be so loose, allowing all sorts of people to be with her. However, if she had that opportunity of marriage, maybe she would not, she wouldn't want a life as a prostitute. Ravina says, Ki ha Rabbi Yehudah mishum milsa d'isura. Ravina says that Rabbi Yehudah would agree in this scenario. Why? Because there's a reason to redeem her, so that she should be able to appreciate the value of at least, potentially being a suitable marriage partner. So she could trade in her old lifestyle for that. So therefore, that's a good enough reason to redeem her, so that people don't, there isn't a city where there's a known woman who's sleeping with everyone. So Gemara says, in other words, does Abaye not agree that this would be a good reason to violate a positive commandment? Ha'amar of Chanina Barav Katina, Amar of Yitzchak. Rav Chanina says the name of it. It's like there was a maidservant that was halfway free, halfway owned. How did this happen? She was owned by two partners, and one of them emancipated her. The kuf was Rabbi Vaso Baskaris. They forced the other master to free her as well. And the reason for this, Amar of Nachman, it's like Rav Nachman explained, Minik Hefker Naguba. She was sleeping around the people. That's why they did this. Therefore, we see that if there's a reason to redeem a slave, then it would be permissible to free them. And therefore, even according to Rabbi Yehudah, Gemara says there's a difference. In the scenario of a slave, of a halfway freed slave, she is not able to marry a slave, and she's not either able to marry a free man. She's really stuck, and that's why she's selling her. That's why she's literally selling herself out. Abai says, look, it's true that presumably slave relationships are not exactly long term, but at least there's a possibility of a long term relationship even with a slave. She can have a long term slave relationship. It's called shifra harufa. She can be a shifra harufa, which is sort of a slave who agreed, a slave who agrees, and a woman who and a maid servant who agree to live together, on a long-term basis. So therefore, freeing her so that she could be, marry as a free woman is not a significant incentive. Therefore, Abai did not allow her to be freed. Gufa, what's the original Gemara? Amar Yehudah, Amar Shmuel. Yehudah says the name of Shmuel. Kol Meshachar Abdi Iver Be'eseg. Anyone who frees them, their slaves, violates a positive commandment. Shenever, as the verse states, you should enslave them, indenture them forever. Gemara says, Meisvei. Question: Ma'aser Rabbi Eliezer. There's a story of Rabbi Eliezer. Shenichnas the basic nesas. He did not. He walked into the shul. He couldn't find 10 people. And he freed his servants so they should have a minyan, because a servant cannot participate, cannot count as one of the 10 for a minyan. The Gemara says mitzvah shiny, a positive commandment, is different, and therefore the mitzvah of davening with a minyan was more important than not freeing a slave. Tana Rabbanon, the rabbis taught, you should enslave them forever. For sure, this is a voluntary option. Diva Rabbi Shmuel, this is the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Kiva says, chayva, it's an obligation. So the Gemara says, we're saying that Rabbi Elazar freed his slave. Who said Rabbi Elazar says that there's an obligation to never free a slave? Maybe he holds like Rabbi Shmuel that says that it's a voluntary option. If you want to keep a slave, you could. If you don't want to free them, you're allowed to free them. So Gemara says, so maybe Rabbi Elazar holds like Rabbi Shmuel that it's there's no obligation not to free slaves. The Gemara says, there's a brisa that's very clear, and it says that according to Rabbi Elazar, there is an obligation not to free a slave. So how did Rabbi Elazar himself free a slave? Because he needed to perform the mitzvah, he needed the slave to be a free man, and therefore he was allowed to free him. Rabbi says, there are 3 ways that people that earn money lose their money. The first one is the mafki abdayel cherusa. They free their slaves. They tour their assets on Shabbos to see what's necessary, what needs to be done, and that's the wrong thing. While the rabbi speaks, they go outside and have kiddush. They literally eat the meal while the rabbi is talking.
Kiddush club.
So Amar Rabbi Chiya bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Chiya bar Abba says the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Shtei mishparas hayu b'Yerushalayim. There were two families in Jerusalem. Achas kavos sedasam Shabbos. So one of them used to make their meals on Shabbos. Achas kavos sedasam erev Shabbos, and one of them made their meals on erev Shabbos. Ushteim nekrom, and they were both uprooted. Okay, so what does this mean? The one who made their meals on Shabbos, this means, like Rava said, that they ate their meal while the rabbi was in the middle of speaking. And the group that made their meals erev Shabbos, what was the problem with that? Because there's two versions in Rashi. One version is they'd eat their Shabbos meal like at 5 o'clock in the afternoon today. I'm sorry. In other words, they would eat their Shabbos meal before it was possible to accept Shabbos. Or alternatively, they would eat a very filling meal for lunch, like they would eat every day of the week. But what that meant was their Shabbos meal, they were all full already. They couldn't eat any Shabbos meal, and that was what they did wrong, and that's why both families ended up being uprooted. Okay, I'll continue tomorrow. We're going to put out there an open question in terms of Tisha B'Av. And the Gemara in Gittin in about 3 weeks time, it's going to be a Gemara that is permissible to learn on Tisha B'Av. And therefore I'm thinking of skipping that block Gemara, going a block ahead. And Tisha B'Av will do that block Gemara, and we'll do it an hour before Shabbos. Because Tisha B'Av is over at 9:23, and it's extremely the most difficult share I give is after Hasday. It's very difficult for me. So if that works for everybody, that would be a preferred option.